Hello, welcome to Accessibility Resource Center at IIT Madras. Today we have the privilege of interviewing Ambassador Victoria Harrison. She is the Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the Republic of Slovenia. Ambassador Victoria Harrison was appointed to British Ambassador to Slovenia in August 2024. After graduating in Russian from the University of Nottingham, Ambassador Victoria Harrison joined UK diplomatic service in 1997 and has served overseas as Second Secretary in the British Embassy in Helsinki and as Deputy Head of Mission in the British Embassy in Sarajevo. Ambassador Harrison has carried out wide range of policy and corporate roles in Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as secondments to the Ministry of Justice and Home Office. She has held senior leadership roles covering areas including human rights, human resources, information technology, commercial governance, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. Ambassador Harrison has a postgraduate diploma in Islamic Studies from the University of Sarajevo and an MSc in Business and Occupational Psychology from Kingston University. Ambassador Harrison is trustee for several charities which support the inclusion of visually impaired people in the arts and sports. Ambassador Harrison is vision impaired and is accompanied by her on her postings to Slovenia by her guide dog Otto. Hema.
Thank you, Sanjay. Maybe I can introduce myself. Uh, Ambassador, this is Hemachandran Karah. I teach here at the Humanities and Social Sciences faculty. I'm visually impaired. I am the founder and principal investigator of the Accessibility Research Center here at IIT Madras. So that's my brief introduction. How about you, Sanjay?
Hello, Ambassador. I'm Sanjay Pulipaka. I'm the founder of Politia Research Foundation. I work on international politics and security issues. Hema.
Ambassador, would you like to say anything, or shall we proceed with the questions that we sent to you?
So I'd love to say something. So I am absolutely delighted to be here with you today. I feel it's a huge honor speaking to you and speaking to IIT Madras, because all of my research shows me just what a prestigious, highly regarded and diverse organization and institution you are. And particularly when I was looking at the Accessibility Research Centre yesterday, I was reading and looking at the videos, and everything I read, I went, wow, this speaks to me and absolutely aligns with things that I think are so important. It's also great to be with you in Tamil Nadu, because I know that of all of the states in India, Tamil Nadu is one of the most progressive when it comes to the inclusion of people with disabilities, which is great to hear. I know all of us have always got more to do, but that's a great foundation. And the other thing, of course, is in terms of the timing of this, it's fantastic to be here just less than a week after Prime Minister Modi's historic visit to the UK and the signing of the UK-India Free Trade Agreement, and all of those agreements and things which just cemented the strong and enduring ties between the UK and India. So obviously, this is far less significant, me speaking to you, than your Prime Minister meeting our UK Prime Minister. But I feel it's yet another example of where the UK and India can really work together, and we can be better together when we cooperate on these things. So absolutely delighted to be here and to be interviewed today.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for the kind words and talking about the India-UK bilateral relationship and the new pathways that it is charting in the recent past. Ambassador, you started your diplomatic career in the year 1997. What are the significant support systems that you have seen evolve that can support people with disabilities who wish to pursue a career in diplomacy?
I think that's a really good question. And for those younger listeners and viewers, I just want to assure you that the dinosaurs had left the Earth by 1997. So it may seem a very long time ago, but yeah, it feels sometimes like yesterday to me. So I think the interesting thing in the UK in 1997, we had just 2 years previously introduced disability legislation. So we had anti-discrimination legislation, so it became illegal to discriminate on the basis of disability. But that was pretty much all we had. And I was the first person with a significant disability to join our diplomatic service. And so I've reflected on the things that have changed. And I think in terms of support systems and that have changed, I think there are kind of three big sort of factors. Firstly, in terms of technology and practical support that you need, it's much easier now in our diplomatic service to request it. There's much more of an understanding that you might need a screen reader or a magnifier or a voice input device, but also that you might need different things when you're on an overseas posting or overseas mission, because you might need adaptations to your accommodation or some other changes. So there's a greater understanding and a greater ability to get that support. It's not always quick, it's not always perfect, but it's much better. The second thing is peer support. And I and one of my colleagues, Sanjay Gould, who was actually a diplomat here in India a few years ago, we established the very first disability network for staff within our diplomatic service, within our foreign ministry, way back in the late 1990s. But it wasn't very big, there weren't many people. But now that disability network has expanded, and particularly since our foreign ministry and our development department merged a few years ago, we have a really strong peer support network for staff with disabilities. And that's great because they're people you can go to and you can talk to, and actually together as a collective, you can lobby the administration for changes, and you have safety in numbers. But then I think in terms of the biggest but the hardest to measure support system that's really changed is just the general understanding and awareness. I don't feel now that I have to start every sentence with, I'm really sorry, but I need this. I can actually say, I need this because of my disability. And I think that there are now many more people who understand that disability is something that makes life harder, but it's also something that means that we actually bring different skills and we are still people, even though we're people with disabilities. So those, I think, are the sort of really the kind of the different things that have changed. And as I don't think we're at the end of the journey yet, I think we're always going to need to improve and evolve, but it definitely has been a shift in the last almost 30 years.
I actually warmly appreciate the kind of support that I received as a student. I was a student at Cambridge for my doctoral study, and I got enormous amount of support from the Disability Resource Center, whether it is Braille printout or refreshable Braille machines, or training in orientation and mobility around the town, and many more. So I can definitely vouch for the social model, how it works in United Kingdom, and how supportive it is. I got here. Shall we go with the next question?
Yes,
I have for you? That is, how does one deal with fast-paced careers such as yours, especially with a disability? And what is the best possible assortment of accessibility toolkit that you may recommend for young people who may take fondly to diplomacy?
So I think when I read this question, I thought this is interesting because actually I think the world is very fast paced now. Technology is a great enabler, but it also means that everything moves more quickly and everyone expects everything to move more quickly. So yes, diplomacy is a fast paced career, but then so is technology, so is academia, so is finance. So I think that all careers now are much faster paced than they were. And yeah, I think like any career which has its unpredictable moments, like diplomacy, in diplomacy, no 2 days are the same. There could be an international crisis, which means that you have to change your schedule and work in different ways and read lots of material. I think, yes, it can be a challenge, but it can be a challenge for anyone. It can be a challenge for people who don't have any disability. It can be a challenge for people who have other needs or personal needs or family needs. So I think it's a challenge, but it's also very rewarding. But then coming on to the accessibility toolkit, and I think this is really interesting because I thought to myself, first of all, about technology, and I love, I love tech. I buy far too much different new assistive tech. I'm like, wow, this gadget does this. And I'm also very glad now that most things you can get now are downloadable apps to your phone, which don't cost quite so much money. But I think that when I'm thinking about the accessibility toolkit, I think there are a few things. I think particularly if you have a disability that means that interacting with information, whether that be through a computer or a phone or other devices, I think there are some things you need. So you need to have the basic skills of technology up to a much higher level than somebody who doesn't have these needs, because inevitably things move more quickly. You're going to need to have those basic IT skills, which I actually think that the younger generation now do have. I think as well, what you need is to be as confident as you can using a range of assistive technology that meets your needs. So for me, I'm very familiar with the JAWS screen reader on Windows. I'm very familiar with the VoiceOver screen reader on my phone and on my iPad. And I also keep up to date with new developments. Now, some of them I can't have on my work devices, but I can use in my personal life, like the AI photo description apps like Be My Eyes, Be My AI. So having an understanding and knowing where to go for support with assistive technology is really important. But I actually think in terms of your accessibility toolkit, again, it's not really about technology. It's actually within you. It's a really good understanding of what your accessibility needs actually are. And a lot of us with disabilities spend most of our time trying to show people what we can do and not what we find harder. So this can be quite difficult, but having a really good understanding of what it is that actually, if somebody says to you, how can we help you? Or what adjustments, that's a very British term, what adjustments do you need in the workplace? We often say that because our legislation talks about reasonable adjustments for disabled people. So when people ask what are your accessibility needs, having the answer and not just saying, oh no, I'm fine, I'm great, it's all fine, and then finding things difficult. So really understanding what are your accessibility needs, how can you explain them to other people who don't live in your body, don't know what your condition is like at that moment or your history, and also having the confidence to advocate and speak up for your accessibility needs in different settings. And that I think can be quite hard because, again, we like to be showing what we can do, and sometimes we have to, in order to make sure that things are actually easier for us, we have to focus on the things that are harder. So I think your accessibility toolkit is about knowing what technology is out there and what might help you, knowing knowing how to use that technology if you can, but also being able to explain what your access needs are, because access needs, as we know, technology is only just one part of it, and actually it's often other people's small behavior changes that make the real difference.
Oh, definitely. Thank you, Ambassador.
Ambassador, you said that technology is only one part of it. Education and institutions are also very important. How did your education and the institutions with which you were associated prepare you for your work as a diplomat with disabilities? Did you always plan to be a diplomat, or did it happen along the way? What additional preparations? What additional preparations did you make when you actually decided to become a diplomat?
Sorry, I forgot the end of the question there. So, thank you. I had decided when I was a teenager that I wanted to be a diplomat, but I possibly didn't quite understand what a diplomat did. So, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, there were lots of changes happening in Europe with the fall of communist regimes. And I remember watching the TV news with my father, and they talked about diplomats. And I asked my dad what a diplomat did, and he gave me a long explanation. But what I understood from this very long explanation as a 13-year-old was diplomats are people who get paid to travel the world and learn languages. And I thought that sounds great. And so that sounds like a really good job. I think we might have even been on holiday at the time. So I thought it was just like a long holiday. I did learn it's not quite like that. But I think so from an early age, I was interested in foreign policy, international affairs. So I think that's what inspired me to apply to become a diplomat. And then at university, I was very interested in languages. I was actually pushed into languages at school because I don't think my school wanted me to mess up their science results in exams. I don't think my school really knew how to support someone with partial sight, because I was the only one with partial sight, with any disability in my year at school. So I think they sort of pushed me into languages. So anyway, I studied Russian as my first degree at university. And just as you were saying about how your Disability Resource Centre at Cambridge really supported you, I went to the University of Nottingham, which is in the East Midlands, so in the centre of England, and I couldn't believe just how much support was available to me there. I hadn't had much support at school, partly because I said I didn't need it, even though I found it quite difficult to read things, but I didn't want to be different. And partly because my school, not having many people with disabilities and me being the only person in the school with a visual impairment, actually they didn't know how to support me. I got to university and people were saying, well, what do you need? There's this equipment and there's this budget for this equipment. And actually, it wasn't so much the equipment I had at university, but just the attitudes of my tutors, the professors in my department. They hadn't had a blind student, or at that stage I was still partially sighted. My sight deteriorated in during my childhood and teens, and then I became registered blind in my early 20s. But I still had a significant visual impairment. And so the tutors and professors just being open, saying, well, to be honest, we've not taught a student like you, but we're going to make it work. It was that attitude that made me think I'm just as valid as anyone else. And I think that was really important to me. I did take a term out of university when my sight started to get much worse, and I went off to a specialist further education college for blind and partially sighted people in England. And that's where I learnt orientation and mobility. I learnt more effectively how to use different assistive technology. So I think that time I spent away from my main studies was really important, but also just having the attitude of people around me when I was at university, that they saw me not as different in a bad way, but somebody who might need things presented in a different way, but actually still just as equal. So I think that was really important. And I applied straight from university to join our diplomatic service. And then the other studies I've done since were while I was working. So when I was posted in Sarajevo as deputy ambassador, I did a diploma in Islamic studies at the university there. And also since I've been working, I've done a couple of master's courses in the UK. And I think what amazes me is just from the shift from when I was studying in the 1990s, where the internet was there but not very used, to now, and the amount of technology that's available now. I think that's a big shift. But I would say overall that the thing that universities can really do, and this is quite hard to quantify, is actually give students with disabilities the self-belief that actually, for whatever career they want to do, they are as capable, as valid of applying and working in those fields. So I think that's really important.
Absolutely. Can we really look for examples and case studies concerning the enduring tie between the practice of diplomacy and accessibility?
So this is an interesting question, and I think there are examples across the world of diplomats with different disabilities and different access needs in different diplomatic services across the world. But I think that they're still quite scattered. I think that often it's quite a kind of big thing because there aren't that many of us with disabilities in high profile roles like ambassadors or in sort of, in very sort of media facing roles. So I think there aren't that many examples. We could keep, we if we look, we'll find them. I mean, in some ways, for me, the dream would be that actually people would be watching this and going, well, so what? So we have someone who's blind and who's an ambassador. That's just normal, and it doesn't necessarily need to be someone who's blind. It could be they could be deaf, they could be, have a non-visible disability or other disabilities. And almost that people are just like thinking, well, why, why is this such a big thing, or why do we need an accessibility research centre? So I'm not trying to do you out of a job, but it would be lovely to be in a world where these things are just so known that actually, we don't need to think of them as case studies.
Talking about diplomacy as a career, compared to other professions, it is perceived that diplomats should be careful about how they handle and disseminate the classified information. Is this viewed as a special challenge for diplomats with disabilities?
So when I read this question, I thought, absolutely, this isn't an issue. It's just the same for diplomats with disabilities. But then I thought back to my earlier years in our foreign ministry, and particularly when having a disability and being a diplomat was such a new thing for our foreign ministry. I think that then, and I don't think it's necessarily just about classified information, but I think that there were people who looked at me and all they could see was my disability. I don't think they even could see, they were so worried and so focused on, well, this disability means that Victoria can't do this, and this, her blindness means that she won't be able to do this, and there's no way she's going to be able to read this material that she needs to read or take records of meetings and all of those things. So I think that and there still are people, not with bad intentions, but just with not much awareness, who see a disability and don't see the person, but they see somebody with a disability and they see a problem, rather than thinking, actually, what you've got here is somebody who has clearly, has a disability, but they've managed to achieve everything they have with that disability. So actually, they're not a problem, but they are an innate problem solver. So I think it's not a challenge, but just with many things in diplomacy, the challenge is sometimes convincing people to shift their mindset, particularly if they're not very familiar, perhaps nervous, perhaps not wanting to offend. So that, I think, is where the challenge comes. But I don't think it's just in diplomacy. I think it can happen in lots of professions and in lots of areas, that they see, people see someone who's blind and immediately they're thinking of all the things we can't do, not realizing that actually, we've got to this, we've been on this earth for several years, several decades in my case. We've lived with our disability for a long time, and therefore actually what might be a challenge to someone else is probably a challenge that we've already overcome.
Of course. Is social media a special enabler for people with a disability or diplomats with disability? Or if I can put it the other way, how did diplomats with disabilities deal with social challenges and the like before the digital revolution, as it were?
That's a good question. And I mean, I think social media for people with disabilities, actually, let's leave aside the diplomats bit for a moment, I think is a real it's a real game changer, because actually a lot of people with disabilities, I'm not stereotyping particular disabilities, but a lot of people with disabilities may feel isolated because they don't know other people with any disability or with the same or similar disability. So social media has been a game changer in connecting people, creating networks, actually creating bodies of people who can support each other in the virtual world and in the digital world. And also helping people to realize they're not alone, and maybe share tips and hacks on how to do things and how to manage processes or particular tasks. So I think social media has been a game changer. I would say, though, the other thing about social media, if you can hear any noises in the background, by the way, this is my guide dog Otto. He's just having a very large drink behind me. So it's not English rain that you're hearing. The thing I would say as well, the thing about social media, the flip side, of course, is that those who may have outdated attitudes towards disability, may actually have some very discriminatory beliefs about disability, may have some quite offensive beliefs about disability. It's easier for them, because they're anonymous, to be able to share those. So it can be quite an unpleasant space for people with disabilities, but that's generally. For diplomats, I think it's actually, well, certainly for me, I've just mentioned my guide dog Otto. Actually, the social media posts of my very cute looking guide dog, even about quite serious political issues, they get lots and lots of likes, because people click on the picture and then they read the serious message. So actually, for me, I call him my soft power tool, because he's very soft and he's definitely powerful. So I think that's something I would say that definitely, it can be an advantage. How did disabled diplomats work before the digital revolution? I don't really know, because when I joined it wasn't quite so digital, but we had email, we had the internet, we were using computers. I'm guessing that the world moved more slowly before we used that. So I'm guessing that people probably had more human support, maybe using Braille, maybe if they could read printed material, they could have some kind of magnification system. So I would imagine it was possible, because things were not moving as quickly. And we were using, I guess, faxes and things. So things you didn't send a message or an email and you got an answer straight away. So I'm guessing that people probably adapted, but I'm also thinking that there were probably fewer people, certainly with the sort of challenges where you might need assistive technology. I think some of the challenges around physical access, they're similar to what they have been. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and I don't really know how people coped or would have coped if there weren't that, if it's a hypothetical question. So I don't know.
Perhaps you're right. They might have used lots of human support, and readers, scribes, and so on, who may have been replaced by screen readers and other computational programs now.
I think that could be the case, actually, because if you think, thinking back to when I joined the Foreign Ministry and people telling me how it used to be, everyone had secretarial support, because people would write things in longhand and then it was typed up. So there was a lot more human support around. So I imagine that the systems would have adapted. But yeah, it would be definitely it would be interesting to imagine what it would be like to be a diplomat of the 1960s or 70s with a disability, being blind, or have it, or some other disability, which means accessing printed information is harder.
Thank you. Actually, this is a sensitive question, meaning, how do you deal with euphemisms? For example, some may call you visually challenged, or a person with special needs. And there are millions of nomenclatures that go around disability. How do you handle that, Ambassador?
I think I've learnt to handle it and to accept it for what it is. It happens actually so often, but it's not normally in the world of diplomacy. So a few weeks ago, I was traveling through the airport and I was traveling with my guide dog through security, and the person at the security check didn't know what to do with my guide dog. So he went to his radio and he said, "We've got a passenger here who's, you know, oh, I don't know how to say this, less sighted, less sighted." And I said to him, "You can say blind. That's what I am." He went, I think that was really bad to say blind. I don't want to offend you. And I'm thinking, well, actually, that's what I am. And I think that it was just, yeah, it was the fact that he thought that saying, less sighted was somehow better than blind. But then the challenge as well is that some people don't, everyone has their own sort of internal comfort level of what they're happy to be called and how they're happy to have their disability described. I think traveling the world, going to different places, you have to develop a bit of a tolerance for those times where people might use terms that, not because they're trying to be offensive. I mean, that's a different matter. If there's something that really crosses a line and uses things which are actually, offensive, that's different. But actually using terms visually impaired, visually challenged, I've heard partially blind, partially sighted, all of these things, special needs, again, it's all of these I've sort of accepted as people trying to meet you where they think you want to be met and how they think you want to be described. Sometimes I say, don't worry, I'm happy to be described as blind, but also there are cultural differences. So in Slovenia, the word for someone who is disabled is invalid, as in invalid. And when I first was learning Slovene, I was like, wow, we wouldn't call anyone in the UK now an invalid. It sort of looks like something out of, I don't know, a Charles Dickens novel or something. But this is just the word that is used. And so, invalidnost is disability, but it's something that I think that I've developed a sort of sense of accepting that this is how people describe people. And also, like with the example of the airport, which happened in a UK airport, I can think about it afterwards. And actually, my way of coping with things like that is I sent a message to my sister and said, this is what I've just been called. And she said, well, technically they're right, as in a sort of, haha, yes, you are less sighted. But actually, so I think it's just something which is part of life. But the other thing I think that is quite interesting is if you can take the time to think, why are people using that term? Does that say something about the way that disability is seen in that society? Does that say something about sort of cultural norms, not in a bad way, but just understanding differences? So yeah. So the short version is you have to develop a bit more of a tolerance to being described in different ways, I think, when you move around internationally.
Here we have a term called differently abled. That's a very popular terminology in English, and its equivalent exists multilingually.
Yes. It's an interesting one. So I've heard it, and then I've heard it and yeah, it definitely exists as well. I mean, I've heard it. I don't know. So sometimes I think that can work. Other times I wonder, because I actually think that sometimes that doesn't necessarily convey quite the challenges that some people with different disabilities have in accessing society, accessing the world. And it's interesting because it focuses on the fact that we are all actually, we are all different, and that's positive. Sometimes I think, does it say enough to those who are policymakers, those who are providing the services, that actually, there are different challenges But it's interesting because differently abled, again, yeah, it does. It explains who we are, and that actually we are all able, but just in different ways.
Thank you, Ambassador. We are talking a lot about here about accessibility, ability, but how do you define diplomacy? Is diplomacy an art? Do you think accessibility thinking can add value to the art of diplomacy?
So I think diplomacy is definitely an art. I mean, there are some more structural, more scientific parts of diplomacy when you look at how big international organizations such as the United Nations operate. They have rules, they have structures, they have processes that have to be followed. So some of that is less of an art and more of a set of procedures. But yeah, generally diplomacy is an art. And actually, I think accessibility is a really important enabler in diplomacy, because when you're thinking about accessibility, what you're thinking, the mindset you have to get into is thinking, not everyone sees the world as I do. Not everyone accesses the world as I do. Some people have different challenges. Some people will find things easier or harder or need different ways of doing things. And actually, diplomacy is all about trying to see the world as other people see it. And when you are negotiating, when you are thinking about how you can strengthen relationships with another country, or how you can negotiate with another country or another power which maybe has a different viewpoint, you have to put yourself into their shoes and think about the world from their perspective. So actually, accessibility is, in a sort of strange way, is actually what we're all doing as diplomats. We just don't think of it in disability terms. But actually, when you're talking to somebody from another country or somebody that you need to persuade, you do think, not from a disability perspective, but you think, how can I persuade them? What are the arguments? What are the ways of saying this that are actually going to resonate? And accessibility is sort of simply an extension or a different way of looking at that. When you've got somebody with maybe a different disability, that you might think, what can I do to ensure that that person has access to the same information opportunities so that the playing field can be level? So I actually think that thinking about accessibility is something which is actually important. Because accessibility, it goes beyond disability. Actually, it could be about language. It could be about the fact that people don't operate in English, or people need material in a different format, or people need to have things presented, or using language which fits with their own sort of cultural, historical experiences. So yeah, I actually think accessibility and thinking about accessibility as a mindset can actually be can be really important and powerful in diplomacy.
You said it so well, Ambassador, because you called it accessibility as a mindset. I mean, a lot of people stop thinking about accessibility beyond the ramps. I mean, give a ramp and then you stop there. So accessibility is a mindset, and that's such a way to look at any discipline or any art, including diplomacy.
I think that's right. And I think the reason I think accessibility is a mindset is so often it's not the ramp, it's not the braille printouts, or it's not having the induction loop for somebody with a hearing aid. It's actually about simply somebody just putting themselves, getting out of their own world for a moment and putting themselves into somebody else's world, and actually thinking, what is it that I can do? Small changes, like for me, one thing I ask for at meetings, particularly big meetings, or if I'm, say, in like a sort of seminar at work with a lot of my colleagues, I always say, to the organizer, could you just ask that when people speak, they actually say their name and which post or which part of the world they're from, because we'll all be sort of ambassadors from different parts of the world. And when we have a big meeting, I ask people to go around the table at the beginning to say their names. And actually, it's not just helping me, I've discovered. It's actually a lot of people have come up to me and said, I'm so glad you did that, because there's a whole load of people. I never knew who he was. And he thinks everyone knows. So I think that the thing is, it's actually, it helps. These sorts of things can really help everyone. But it's a mindset. It's also, I think it's a muscle that we all need to keep exercising. It's not something where, you just do it once and, that's it.
Wow. So warm up is required every day. Thank you. Actually, a practical question here. Suppose you are on missions abroad and there are staff with disability you need to support, and those cultures are very different and they don't look at the way you look at it, the support system. How do you handle such challenges, Ambassador?
I think this is again quite an interesting question, because there are as many different sort of cultural and different approaches to disability as there are disabilities. I think in our embassies abroad, so we obviously have a very strong, the values that the UK puts on, the United Kingdom puts on inclusion, whether it be about disability inclusion or gender inclusion, and other sorts of inclusion between different people from different ethnic backgrounds. Those sorts of inclusion will permeate every one of our embassies and high commissions across the globe. But as you say, there are different cultural norms, because in our embassies we have not just British diplomats, we have people recruited locally, and that means that you've got at least two cultures, normally many more than two cultures and two sets of cultural norms which are being brought together. So there is something about, actually, it's really important to understand. I think if you're going to support staff with disabilities to be fully included, not just in the work of an embassy, but actually in living in the country and having a fulfilling life as well as work, it is important to understand how different countries approach disability. But I think what's interesting is that often what you read and what you hear is very different to what you actually experience. So I'll give the example of being posted to Bosnia. So I was in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It was about 15 years after the really brutal war of the 1990s, where lots of people were killed, but many more people, particularly young, healthy men, became amputees, had significant disabilities. Now, on paper, Bosnia as a country at the time didn't have disability legislation, didn't have particularly good practical facilities for people with disabilities. But I got there, and amazingly, because people were so used to knowing healthy young people or healthy sort of working age adults who had become disabled, everyone had an attitude of, okay, we don't quite know how we're going to help you, but we will find a way. And it was actually an attitude that was there, that was brilliant. I mean, it came out of absolute tragedy, but it was something which you wouldn't think about on paper, certainly at the time. So I think there is, yes, you've got obviously different cultural norms that are being brought together, but I think it's also worth, when you're supporting staff with disabilities, and every disability and everyone's life circumstance is different, I think it's also scratching beneath that surface to what what some of those prevailing attitudes really are.
Wow. So observing the lived life is as
Yes.
important as the work day accessibility.
Definitely. You've got to, yeah, you've got to think about this. I mean, particularly with diplomats, and we've got to also think about their families because they could have family members with disabilities. Diplomatic services post their diplomats around the world. In our organisation, we get a choice about where we go, so we often research places which are going to be more accessible and inclusive. But you've still got to think about the small things that might make a difference between somebody feeling that they're enjoying living and working somewhere and feeling that, not unhappy, feeling it's a challenge. So yeah, so it's definitely, it's life and work, I think, is important.
My next question is it's mostly about the body language. I think how how much important is body language understanding important for a professional diplomat? And if it is so important, how do you handle visual symbolisms and other non-verbal communication cues and all that, Ambassador? How does it work for you?
So I think that this is a good question. It's one that I've thought of a lot. And I used to worry actually quite a lot about not being able to pick up on nonverbal communication. And there are things, I am blind. I will not spot within a room, if I'm in a meeting, I will not spot certain dynamics, certain looks passing between people and that sort of thing. And I have to accept that that's the case. What I do know, though, and what a lot of us, the other thing I should caveat this with is that I did have sight to some extent up until the age of 22. So I understand when people are talking about body language, when people are talking about nonverbal communication. I understand those concepts because I've seen them, so I have that understanding. But what I actually know is, as someone who's blind, you do pick up on things when you're in a room with somebody. You pick up on when the direction of their voice changes, they look away. There's, maybe two people, you can sort of tell that they're maybe sort of, I don't know, laughing to each other and things like that. Small things you do pick up on. You pick up on a lot on tone of voice. So I think that does help. I think one of the challenges is that since we do a lot more on video communication, I think that all becomes a lot harder because it's very much harder to pick up on those micro signals when you've just got a voice coming out of your headphones or out of your computer speaker than if you're in a room. So I think the body language, nonverbal communication can be important, but so can things like tone, so can the pacing of what people are saying. And also, I am not, if I'm in a meeting with other people, I'm not afraid to ask someone who's a trusted contact, was there anything I might have missed in that meeting? Now, that doesn't help if you're in a critical one-to-one, if you're in a critical one-to-one high stakes negotiation, you can't do that. But actually, if it's a one-to-one negotiation and somebody is trying to communicate with me non-verbally, I'm not going to pick up on it, and I sort of have to accept it. But and so I may, there is a small risk, I guess, that I might miss things, but it's something where I can often ask somebody afterwards how that person looked when they were leaving the room. There are tips and tricks, but there's not yet a solution. The other thing I do sometimes, if I'm, it is to really sort of tune in and think, well, what are the sort of signals? What are the things that might shift? So yeah, we do talk a lot about nonverbal communication, but actually, I think, well, I hope I'm able to manage. I haven't completely solved the problem, but it's something that I can kind of manage and draw on others' support for.
Thank you so much for that most elegant and candid answer, Ambassador. Actually, I also prefer, when it came to teaching, teaching is my profession. So when it came to teaching, I always prefer offline teaching because I am with my students, with them. So I get their cues and they communicate so much. I miss them totally when I'm online. It's very sanitized. So I miss many of their certain topics and themes might send them so might attract them a lot, and certain themes and communication patterns may not go with them well. So I miss them online.
It's really hard, isn't it, online actually? And in the UK during the COVID pandemic, we were locked down, so we did so much online. And actually, I know for a lot of blind people, they found it really isolating. They
Yes.
found, because you just didn't have that, that human interaction that you'd get from something where you'd be sitting in the same room. It's hard to describe because people often said to me, well, don't you love it now that you can do online meetings? You don't have to leave your house. And I'm thinking, it's easier, it's practical in some ways. But on the other hand, it feels like, you're talking to a wall rather than, having a conversation with real people.
Hmm. It, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, we are talking about nonverbal communications here. Is there a possibility that access norms, such as provision of braille printouts or use of sign language, and the art of diplomacy sometimes may come into some kind of a friction? Does this magnify when one deal with diplomats from diverse cultures?
I think that's a good question, and I think that hypothesis hasn't been fully tested because there aren't that many diplomats with disabilities requiring adjustments such as braille printouts or sign language in the same room to have ever really tested it. But I suppose it could, it could pose it could pose I would say a challenge, but it's a challenge to be overcome. I mean, I've had conversations with people who use sign language interpreters, not as a diplomat, just in other things that I've done. And actually, it's something where I think it makes all of us think a lot about accessibility because we're having to use communication methods that work for all of us. So I think where I suppose some of these things could be a challenge is sort of is speed and when things are moving very fast. But actually, if you've got a fast-paced negotiation and people are relying on braille printouts of new drafts of texts to be produced, I mean, yes, it doesn't take very long these days, but it can take, a little bit longer than people who are sort of looking at something and just, basically looking at adjustments on a screen. So I suppose it could be a challenge, but on the other hand, there's another way of looking at it and saying, well, let's approach things differently. Let's make sure that if we are negotiating a text or an agreement, we do it in a way that is working for everyone. So it's working so that those who need sign language interpreters are actually getting the comments made by other people in time to be able to intervene. Those who need to have some way of accessing physical, actual changes to the text can see them. And actually, maybe sometimes slowing things down for everyone is actually beneficial because, for people to be able to pause, wait for a new version to be produced accessibly, actually that gives people time to kind of to think and to reflect. Now, maybe I'm thinking in a kind of ideal world, but it's something where I think that I suppose we haven't tested it, but I think it would probably the first time it was ever sort of really tested in something fast paced. It might not be the easiest, but then we could always say, well, what do we need to do? Let's start from scratch. What are we trying to achieve here, and how can we do it in the most accessible way, rather than, okay, this is the way that we've always negotiated the text of an agreement. Let's just overlay some accessibility things on top, and hope that it works. So yeah.
I'm going the other way around now, Ambassador. Is your disability a special enabler? Have you thought about it that way? I mean, for example, one's disability may come handy in building bridges, crossing the fences, and bringing institutions together, which may not do otherwise. Is that possible?
I think it is. So there's a few things here. So I think having a disability and being an ambassador means that I do engage and have a natural affinity with particular groups in society in Slovenia, those working with, people representing people with disabilities, particularly those who are blind and partially sighted, that someone else, someone who wasn't blind, wouldn't have. So that's something, I can reach different parts of society. But I think the most important thing for me is that because I need help with things, it humanizes and takes away the fact that I'm not just the ambassador and I'm a profession, I'm actually a person. So let's say I go into a meeting with someone else. It's a one-on-one meeting and someone brings in the coffee and I reach for my coffee cup and I can't actually find it. And I don't really want to be waving my arms around because, knocking the coffee cup off the table at a serious meeting is probably not a good look. So actually, the other person who I'm dealing with might just, take my hand and just put it towards that coffee cup. That simple gesture of physical contact, of interaction, of helping can really break down some barriers. We could be talking about something really difficult where we fundamentally disagree and we've got opposing viewpoints, but somehow we've managed to, get through that professional disagreement to a personal connection. And it can really, I think, I don't know what it's like for the other person, but for me, it somehow sort of makes us realize that we're actually just humans and we're all, we're just human beings. Yes, we may have different viewpoints, but fundamentally we're people. And the same at the end of the meeting when I sort of stand up to leave and they might say, oh, can I guide you out of the room? That again is that it's actually, it permeates the professional. It goes beyond that professional to the personal level. And then the final thing for me is having a guide dog. Actually, this is the first posting I've done with a guide dog. He's my second guide dog, but I didn't have a guide dog when I was on my last posting in Bosnia. So I having a guide dog and going into meetings with my guide dog, the number of times where it takes us a while to get down to business because the other person is stroking my dog and talking about how lovely my dog is. And it's great because I'm thinking I can just get in with a really sort of difficult thing saying, we really disagree with you, or we have different viewpoints on this particular issue. And, they're sort of going, yeah, and they're stroking the dog and it's somehow, it can actually, again, I say Otto's my soft power tool, but he definitely is a way of relaxing a meeting and again, sort of making it, making sure that we remember that we're humans. So yeah, so I think for me, the short version of this is that actually having a disability, needing help with something, sometimes quite small things, actually means that we remember in interactions that we are actually just human beings. We might be representing countries and we might be dealing with very difficult professional issues, but actually at the end of the day, we are just humans.
Absolutely. Actually, I'm reminded of a classroom anecdote. I was standing and lecturing, but with the wrong angle. I was not facing the student.
I'm laughing just because I've been there. Yeah.
And I was looking at the window probably. So one of my students got up, she came to me, turned me to the right direction, and just went, sat, and said, "Sir, you can proceed." So how beautiful that was.
So beautiful that, because it's that thing where you don't realize, and just that human gesture, you're thinking, actually, and wow, what there is there is kindness, and also that all the other students will think, that man's a human, that, this is a human being. And, as a teacher, people probably are also thinking, everything, but it's kind of that then that interaction really transcends the power dynamic between teacher and student. So, yeah.
Since we're talking about students and youngsters, what advice would you offer to young diplomats or young people with disabilities trying to become diplomats? What measures do you propose to make the art of diplomacy ready to accommodate young aspirants with diverse abilities?
I think so. The advice I would give to organisations and institutions, and whether it's about diplomacy or anything else, is be open to the fact that people may do things differently. If somebody comes to you, applies for a job, and they've got a disability, don't focus first on, oh, they've got a disability, they can't see, that means they can't do this. Think, well, they've got this far in their life with this disability, therefore there must be a way that they do things. And actually, what else do they bring in terms of resilience and problem solving and a different kind of empathy? To young people, what I would say is definitely go for it. It's a fantastic career. It's not an easy career, but then I don't think anything is. It's a challenge, and possibly, there are different challenges if you've got a disability in adapting to living in different countries, but it's also really rewarding. In terms of tips, I think it goes back to what I said earlier. I think for me, the key thing is understanding and really reflecting what your needs are in terms of accessibility, from the big things like screen readers and, dare I say, the ramp, which is sometimes needed, or sign language interpreters, or big sort of things that you may need, down to the small behaviors that make a difference. Like, for me, and just as you've said about sort of angling yourself when you're speaking, is when I have to do a speech, I always ask one of my colleagues to kind of put me in the right position for exactly that reason. So I think for young people, it's really reflecting on what their access needs are, so that when someone says, how can we help you, you can answer it. And showing what you can do, but also being honest about the things you need to work with those challenges. I think that's really important, so you can really advocate for your own access needs. The other thing I would say to young people with disabilities, either contemplating a career in diplomacy or actually they've already started a career in diplomacy, is build your support network within the organisation. Build up people who can be allies, who can advocate for you. Because sometimes, particularly when you're new to an organisation, it's harder to have a voice. But actually, if you can explain to people who can, maybe your mentor or your manager or somebody else, what you need, they can really help to advocate for you. But the main thing I say to people is absolutely go for it. It's a fantastic career. Being a diplomat with a disability, well, I don't know what it's like being a diplomat without a disability, so I can't say what the difference is. I think there are challenges, but we as people with disabilities, we're basically problem solvers, and so it's just another set of problems that you will that you will work out how to overcome, and believe in yourself. And definitely, if you're interested in diplomacy, I'd really encourage it as a career.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Actually, quite plenty of things we learned together by talking to you. One of the things I can recall is diplomacy is maybe art of perfecting conversation. Maybe it is about finding common ground. Maybe it is building level playing fields, or building universal norms and specific accessibility principles. Or it may be all about everything inclusion, all things inclusion, and so on. And so many things we have learned. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I'm delighted to have been here today with you. Thank you.